My name is Jasmine Williams, and at 32 years old, I thought I had secured my dream career at Maxwell Enterprises. For 7 years, I poured my heart into that company, becoming the backbone of their merger acquisition team and helping increase profits by millions. Then one ordinary Tuesday, the CEO's son, Bradley, recently appointed as vice president, called me into his office. With a smirk that still makes my blood boil, he said those words I will never forget. "You're just Clutter here. If you're watching this, drop a comment letting me know where you're from, and hit that like and subscribe button as I reveal how a hidden clause in my contract changed everything for me and the company forever." Before I dive into the details of what happened, let me give you some context about who I am and how I ended up at Maxwell Enterprises. I grew up in a small apartment in Chicago with my mother, Teresa, who worked 3 jobs to make ends meet after my father left us when I was just 4 years old. Watching her sacrifice everything for my future instilled in me a work ethic that would eventually become my greatest strength. Despite our financial limitations, I excelled academically and earned a scholarship to Northwestern University, where I completed my undergraduate degree in economics. Determined to break into the financial world, I worked nights at a local diner to save enough money for graduate school. 2 years later, I graduated with a master's in finance from Columbia University, carrying student loans that would take years to repay, but armed with knowledge I was ready to put to good use. My journey to Maxwell Enterprises wasn't planned. I was actually interviewing for a junior analyst position at a different firm when I literally bumped into Robert Maxwell in the elevator. I had spilled coffee on my interview portfolio and was frantically trying to salvage the documents. Instead of being annoyed, Robert was amused by my determination and struck up a conversation. When he discovered I had thoroughly researched his company as a potential employer, he handed me his card and suggested I interview with Maxwell Enterprises instead. "Someone who researches companies they're not even applying to is someone I want on my team," he told me. 3 interviews later, I joined Maxwell Enterprises as a financial analyst. The company was experiencing incredible growth, transforming from a mid-sized investment firm to a major player in tech investments. Within my first 2 years, I had already saved the company millions by identifying problematic patterns in a potential acquisition that everyone else had missed. "You have a gift for seeing what others overlook," Robert told me during my performance review. "That kind of talent is rare and invaluable." By my 3rd year, I was promoted to senior analyst, and by year 5, I became the head of due diligence for all acquisitions. Robert and I developed a professional relationship built on mutual respect. He valued my analytical mind and straightforward approach, while I admired his vision and integrity in an industry often lacking the latter. When I was promoted to this senior position 4 years ago, Robert insisted on adding what he called a loyalty clause to my contract. At the time, I barely paid attention to it. Robert explained it was his way of ensuring that my position would be protected, even if the company leadership changed hands. I remember signing it without much thought, assuming it was standard legal language designed to keep me from being poached by competitors. "This protects both of us," Robert had said. "You're too valuable to lose over office politics." The irony of that statement would only become clear to me years later. Things began to change about 18 months ago when Robert's son Bradley joined the company. Fresh out of Wharton with an MBA, but no real-world experience, Bradley was immediately appointed as vice president of strategy. The appointment raised eyebrows throughout the company, but nobody dared question the decision publicly. Robert was approaching his 60s and had been talking about semi-retirement, so most people assumed Bradley was being groomed to eventually take over. From the moment Bradley arrived, I sensed his dislike toward me. While I tried to be professional and helpful, offering insights on ongoing projects, he seemed to interpret my every suggestion as a challenge to his authority. What bothered him most, I suspect, was the obvious respect his father showed me. "Dad talks about you like you're some kind of financial savant," Bradley once commented during a meeting, his tone making it clear he didn't share that opinion. The first major red flag appeared when Bradley began excluding me from meetings I had always attended previously. Projects I had been leading were suddenly reassigned without explanation. When I raised concerns about a potential acquisition that showed troubling debt patterns, Bradley dismissed my analysis as unnecessarily cautious and proceeded without addressing the issues I had identified. When the acquisition later ran into exactly the problems I had predicted, Bradley never acknowledged his error. Instead, he publicly emphasized how his team had managed to overcome unforeseen complications while giving me sidelong glances. The company culture began to shift under Bradley's influence. Where Robert had cultivated an environment of collaboration and careful analysis, Bradley promoted speed and flashy deals above all else. The thoughtful approach that had made Maxwell Enterprises successful was gradually being eroded, replaced by a culture that rewarded loudness over substance. I tried speaking with Robert about my concerns, but his increasing absences made that difficult. When I did manage to catch him between trips, he seemed distracted and unwilling to interfere with his son's management style. Bradley needs space to find his footing, Robert told me during one brief conversation. Give him time to adjust. He'll recognize your value eventually. I wanted to believe that was true, but the writing on the wall was becoming clearer each day. Something had to give, and unfortunately that something would be me. By the 6th month of Bradley's tenure, the changes at Maxwell Enterprises had become impossible to ignore. One by one, long-time employees were being replaced by Bradley's friends from business school. Amanda from accounting, who had been with the company since its founding, was replaced by Bradley's fraternity brother Jason. Derek, our veteran IT director, was pushed out to make room for Bradley's golf buddy Tyler. With each new hiring announcement, the message became clearer. Loyalty to the company meant nothing compared to loyalty to Bradley. I tried to keep my head down and focus on my work, hoping that results would speak for themselves. But it became increasingly difficult, as Bradley seemed determined to undermine me at every turn. The real turning point came when Maxwell Enterprises began considering a merger with TechVision, a startup that had created buzz in the tech world with its artificial intelligence solutions. On paper, the company looked promising with impressive growth projections and a charismatic founder named Parker Williams, who had become a minor celebrity in tech circles. Bradley was personally championing the acquisition, talking about it constantly in meetings and press releases. This merger will revolutionize our portfolio, he announced during an all-hands meeting. TechVision represents the future, and Maxwell Enterprises will be leading that charge. As head of due diligence, I was assigned to review TechVision's financials before the deal was finalized. What I found immediately set off alarm bells. Their revenue numbers showed suspicious patterns that didn't align with their customer base. Their expenses seemed artificially low for a company of their size and scope. Most concerning was a series of shell companies that seemed to be cycling money back into TechVision's accounts, creating the illusion of growth where there might not be any. I compiled my findings into a comprehensive report and requested a meeting with Bradley to discuss my concerns. When we finally met, his body language made it clear he wasn't interested in what I had to say. These discrepancies could indicate serious financial manipulation, I explained, pointing to the charts I had prepared. At minimum, we need to extend our due diligence period and bring in forensic accountants. Bradley leaned back in his chair, not even bothering to look at my documentation. You're overthinking this, Jasmine. Parker explained all of this. These are just normal startup accounting practices. With all due respect, these are not normal practices, I insisted. The pattern suggests potential fraud. Bradley's face hardened. Are you suggesting I haven't done my homework on this deal? That I'm being duped? I'm suggesting we need to be thorough before committing to a $150 million acquisition. Your excessive caution is why we miss opportunities, he snapped. This is exactly the kind of risk-averse thinking that's holding this company back from truly innovative moves. Risk-averse isn't the same as due diligence, I countered. Your father built this company on careful analysis, not rushing into flashy deals. The moment I mentioned his father, I knew I had made a tactical error. Bradley's face flushed with anger. My father is semi-retired. I'm running things now, and I don't need constant reminders of how he would do things. He dismissed me from his office without even taking my report. That afternoon I tried calling Robert, but his assistant informed me he was on a 3-week cruise in the Mediterranean with limited communication access. The next day I noticed whispers stopping when I entered rooms. My assistant, Megan, who had always been friendly, seemed nervous around me. During lunch in the break room, she finally pulled me aside. "You need to watch your back," she whispered. "I overheard Bradley talking with Human Resources about restructuring your department. He specifically mentioned your position was being reconsidered." I thanked her for the warning, but I wasn't going to go down without a fight. I scheduled a meeting with the executive team to discuss the TechVision acquisition, hoping that presenting my concerns to a broader audience would force Bradley to address them. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday afternoon. I arrived early and set up my presentation, determined to make my case clearly and professionally. As executives filed in, I noticed several unfamiliar faces among them, more of Bradley's recent hires. Robert was still absent off somewhere in the Mediterranean. Bradley arrived last, looking surprised to see me at the front of the room. "I thought this was just a status update," he said. "We don't need a full presentation." "I believe we do," I replied, maintaining eye contact. "There are serious concerns about TechVision's financials that need to be addressed before we proceed." For the next 20 minutes I walked through my findings, pointing out discrepancies and red flags. As I spoke, I could see some of the veteran executives exchanging concerned glances. Even a few of Bradley's friends looked uncomfortable. When I finished, there was a moment of silence before Bradley stood up, his face a mask of controlled anger. "What Jasmine has presented represents her personal opinion, not the official position of our due diligence team," he said smoothly. "While I appreciate her thoroughness, I believe she's missing the forest for the trees. TechVision's innovative approach to business is precisely why traditional metrics might not capture their true value." He turned to me, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Jasmine has always been extraordinarily cautious, which served us well in a different era of this company. But we're entering a new phase now, one that requires vision and courage, rather than excessive fear of risk." I tried to interject. "This isn't about fear of risk. The numbers simply don't add up." Bradley spoke over me. "The problem, I think, is resistance to change. Some of our longer-tenured employees struggle to adapt to new paradigms." He looked directly at me. "Perhaps that's something we need to address going forward." The threat was unmistakable. Several executives averted their eyes, unwilling to get involved. The meeting ended with Bradley announcing that the TechVision acquisition would proceed as planned, with a final vote at the board meeting scheduled for the following month. As people filed out, I noticed how many avoided making eye contact with me. Only Sandra Johnson, one of the board members who had been with the company since its early days, stopped briefly by my side. "That took courage," she said quietly before walking away. In the days that followed, my isolation grew. Colleagues who had once sought my input now avoided me in hallways. I was removed from email chains relevant to my work. My team members were reassigned to other projects without explanation. It became clear that Bradley was systematically cutting me out of the company's operations. One Friday afternoon, I found my access to certain financial databases revoked. When I called IT to resolve what I assumed was a technical issue, the new IT director, Tyler, awkwardly informed me that access restrictions had been implemented at the direction of senior leadership. That weekend, I sat in my apartment staring at the skyline of Chicago, trying to decide what to do. I had invested 7 years of my life in Maxwell Enterprises. I had believed in the company's mission and values, but those values were changing, and it seemed my days were numbered regardless of what I did next. I decided that if I was going to go down, I would go down, standing for what I knew was right. On Monday morning, I would make one final attempt to protect the company from what I increasingly suspected was a fraudulent acquisition. I had no idea that Monday would bring a confrontation far sooner and more brutal than I had anticipated. Monday morning arrived with a crisp autumn chill in the air. I had spent the weekend preparing additional documentation about TechVision's questionable finances, even uncovering connections between Parker Williams and several previously failed startups with similar patterns of financial presence. Manipulation. I felt prepared for whatever the week might bring, but as it turned out, I wasn't. The first sign that something was wrong came when I tried to enter the building. My security badge, which had worked faithfully for 7 years, triggered a red light instead of the usual green. The security guard, Luis, who normally greeted me by name, looked uncomfortable. "I'm sorry, Miss Williams. Your badge isn't active in the system. There must be some mistake," I said, confused. "Can you call upstairs?" Luis made a call while I waited, increasingly aware of the line forming behind me. After a brief conversation, he looked at me with pity. "Human Resources says you're expected upstairs. They'll provide a temporary visitor badge." My stomach dropped. Being issued a visitor badge to a building I had entered as an employee for 7 years was not a good sign. Still, I maintained my composure, as Luis handed me the visitor badge and directed me to the executive floor. When the elevator doors opened on the 35th floor, I found Hannah Parker from Human Resources waiting for me. Hannah had always been friendly, but today her face was a professional mask. "Good morning, Jasmine," she said, her voice deliberately neutral. "If you'll follow me, please." Instead of leading me to the Human Resources department, Hannah escorted me to Bradley's corner office. She knocked once, before opening the door. Bradley sat behind his massive desk, signature smirk already in place. The morning sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind him, creating a silhouette effect that I'm sure he had calculated. A box containing what I recognized as my personal items from my desk sat on a chair near the door. "Take a seat, Jasmine," Bradley said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "I prefer to stand," I replied, determined not to give him the satisfaction of looking down at me. Bradley shrugged. "Suit yourself. This won't take long anyway." He made a show of opening a folder in front of him. "As you may have guessed, your position at Maxwell Enterprises is being terminated effective immediately." Even though I had suspected this was coming, hearing the words still felt like a physical blow. 7 years of dedication, dismissed in a single sentence. On what grounds, I managed to ask, my voice steadier than I felt. Bradley's smirk widened. "Restructuring. Your role has been deemed redundant in our new organizational structure." Redundant. I'm the head of due diligence for all acquisitions. We're in the middle of the biggest acquisition in company history. "And that acquisition is proceeding smoothly without your unnecessary interference," Bradley countered. "Let's be honest, Jasmine. You're just clutter here." His eyes gleamed with satisfaction as he delivered the line. "Dad might have had a soft spot for you, but this is my company now." I glanced at Hannah, who was staring intently at her tablet, avoiding eye contact. She knew this was wrong, but wasn't going to intervene. "The board approved this termination," I asked, remembering what Sandra had said about my courage during the presentation. A flicker of something crossed Bradley's face. "All necessary approvals have been obtained," he said, which I noticed wasn't a direct answer. "Human Resources has prepared your severance package. It's quite generous considering the circumstances." Hannah stepped forward and handed me a thick envelope. "This contains all the paperwork regarding your termination, severance, and continuation of benefits," she explained mechanically. "You'll find everything is in order." I took the envelope but didn't open it. "I'd like to collect my personal items and say goodbye to my team." Bradley shook his head. "That won't be necessary. Your personal effects have already been packed." He nodded toward the box by the door. "As for goodbyes, we find they tend to disrupt productivity. A company-wide email announcing your departure will be sent this afternoon." "You're not even going to let me say goodbye?" I asked, disbelief coloring my voice. "Security will escort you to the lobby," Bradley continued, as if I hadn't spoken. "Your final paycheck will be deposited according to the regular schedule, and of course your non-disclosure agreement remains in effect." He stood up, making it clear the conversation was over. "I wish you the best in your future endeavors, Jasmine." The insincerity of his words made my skin crawl, but I refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing me lose composure. I picked up the box of my belongings, balancing it against my hip. "You're making a mistake, Bradley. Not just with me, but with TechVision. Their financials don't add up." Bradley's smirk hardened into something uglier. The mistake was my father putting so much trust in someone so clearly resistant to innovation. Goodbye, Jasmine. 2 security guards were waiting outside Bradley's office. I recognized one of them, Marco, who had always greeted me warmly in the mornings. Now he couldn't meet my eyes, as he and his colleague escorted me to the elevator. The journey down 35 floors felt endless. Neither guard spoke, and I stood rigidly holding my box of personal items, feeling the eyes of former colleagues on me through the glass walls of the elevator. News traveled fast in the building, and being escorted out by security sent a clear message to everyone cross Bradley Maxwell. And this will be you. When we reached the lobby, Marco finally spoke. I'm sorry about this, Miss Williams. It isn't right. I managed a small smile. Thank you, Marco. Take care of yourself. The walk across the lobby past the security desk where Luis watched with sympathy through the revolving doors and into the bright morning sunlight felt surreal. 7 years of my professional life ended in less than 20 minutes. I somehow made it to my car in the parking garage before the first tear fell. Once I was safely inside, the dam broke. I sobbed, hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. It wasn't just the loss of my job that hurt. It was the callous way I had been discarded, the betrayal by a company I had helped build, and the knowledge that without my voice of caution, Maxwell Enterprises was heading toward a potentially disastrous acquisition. After what felt like hours, I wiped my eyes, started the car, and began the drive home. Halfway there, my phone rang. I answered through the car's Bluetooth system. Jasmine, what's wrong? My mother Teresa's voice came through the speakers. Even after all these years, she could sense when something was wrong with me. I got fired, Mom, I said, my voice cracking. What? That's impossible. Robert promised you job security when you got that promotion. Through my tears, I explained what had happened. Bradley's takeover, the tech vision, concerns the humiliating dismissal. This isn't right, baby, Teresa said firmly. Robert gave you his word. Did you check your contract? There might be something in there to protect you. I hadn't thought about my contract since signing it 4 years ago. I'll look when I get home. Do that, Teresa advised. And remember what I always told you. Sometimes when people push you down, they're actually putting you in position to stand up taller than before. Her words stayed with me as I arrived at my condo building. Instead of collapsing on the couch as I had planned, I went straight to my home office and dug through my filing cabinet until I found the contract from my promotion to head of due diligence. The document was thick, full of legal language I had barely skimmed when signing it. I began reading carefully, searching for anything that might help my situation. On page 17, I found something unexpected. The loyalty clause Robert had mentioned was much more substantial than I had realized. The clause stated explicitly that my position could not be terminated without proper cause and formal approval from the board of directors. If such termination occurred, I would be entitled to compensation equal to 5% of the company's current market valuation. I sat back stunned. Maxwell Enterprises was currently valued at approximately $1.76 billion. 5% of that would be $88 million. With shaking hands, I picked up my phone and called the only lawyer I knew personally, my college friend, Rachel Bennett. They did what Rachel's voice came through my phone with such volume that I had to hold it away from my ear. I had known Rachel since our undergraduate days at Northwestern, where she had been studying pre-law while I focused on economics. Now she was a rising star at a prestigious Chicago law firm specializing in employment law. They escorted me out with security, I repeated, still processing the morning's events myself. Bradley said my position was redundant. That sounds like constructive dismissal, Rachel said, her tone shifting to professional analysis. Send me everything you have from your termination. The severance offer, any emails, everything. There's something else, I added. I found a clause in my contract that seems significant. I read her the loyalty clause, and the line went silent for so long I thought we might have been disconnected. Rachel, are you still there? I'm here, she said, her voice now hushed. Jasmine, do you realize what this means? This could be one of the largest wrongful termination settlements I've ever heard of. If it's enforceable, I cautioned, send me the contract right now. I want my whole team to review it. I scanned and emailed all the documents to Rachel, then paced around my apartment while waiting for her assessment. The initial shock of my termination was giving way to something else: determination. If Bradley thought I would slink away quietly, he had severely underestimated me. 2 hours later, Rachel called back. This contract is ironclad, she announced without preamble. Robert Maxwell had his attorneys create an exceptional level of protection for your position. The language explicitly states that termination requires documented performance issues, a formal improvement plan, and board approval. None of which happened, I confirmed. Exactly. And the compensation clause is valid too. 5% of current market valuation in the event of improper termination. $88 million. I said the number, still difficult to comprehend. At minimum, Rachel replied. The company's stock has been trending upward, with the TechVision acquisition rumors. I sat down, the magnitude of the situation hitting me. I don't want to bankrupt the company, Rachel. Despite everything, there are good people working there. This wouldn't bankrupt them, Rachel assured me. It would hurt, certainly, but Maxwell Enterprises can absorb it. The question is, what do you want to do with this information? I thought about the TechVision deal, about the red flags I had identified, about how Bradley had dismissed my concerns without proper investigation. I want to stop them from making a catastrophic mistake with this acquisition, I said finally, and I want my reputation restored. Then we need more information about this TechVision deal, Rachel said. What exactly made you suspicious? I spent the next hour walking Rachel through the inconsistencies I had found in TechVision's financials: revenue that didn't match their customer base, mysteriously low operational expenses, and the network of shell companies that seemed to be artificially inflating their growth metrics. This sounds like a potential fraud case on top of your wrongful termination, Rachel observed. We need hard evidence before making those allegations, though. Most of my research is still on my work computer, I said. But I did download some key documents to review at home last week. I found my personal laptop and opened the files I had saved. They painted a troubling picture, but there were still missing pieces. I needed more information to build a compelling case. Let me see what I can find publicly, I said, opening a browser. TechVision has been featured in several tech publications. Over the next several hours, I dug deeper into TechVision's history than I ever had before. What I discovered was alarming. Their founder, Parker Williams, had been involved in 3 previous startups, all of which had followed a similar pattern: splashy launches, impressive projected growth, major investments, and then sudden collapses amid allegations of financial affairs. Mismanagement. Each time Parker had walked away unscathed while investors lost millions. Rachel, look at this, I said, sending her links to articles about Parker's previous ventures. It's the same playbook every time. This is concerning, Rachel agreed. But we still need to understand why Bradley is so determined to push this acquisition through despite these red flags. That question had been bothering me too. Bradley was arrogant and dismissive. But he wasn't stupid. What was I missing? I decided to reach out to Sandra Johnson, the board member who had spoken to me after my presentation. Finding her personal contact information took some creative searching, but eventually I located her email address through a charity organization where she volunteered. I crafted a careful message explaining that I had been terminated and had concerns about both the legality of my dismissal and the TechVision acquisition. To my surprise, Sandra responded within an hour, suggesting we meet at a coffee shop far from the Maxwell Enterprises offices. The following morning I arrived at the cafe 20 minutes early and chose a table in the back corner, with a clear view of the entrance. Sandra arrived precisely on time, elegant in a navy pantsuit, her silver hair pulled back in a sleek bun. "Jasmine," she said warmly as she sat down. "I'm so sorry about what happened. The way they handled your departure was shameful." "Thank you for meeting with me," I said, genuinely touched by her support. I need to understand what's happening with the Tech Vision deal. Sandra glanced around before leaning forward. The board never approved your termination, she said quietly. In fact, most of them don't even know you've been let go. Bradley told us you had resigned to pursue other opportunities. This revelation shouldn't have surprised me, but it still did. That's absolutely false. I was escorted out by security. I suspected as much, Sandra nodded. Robert would never have allowed that to happen to you. Unfortunately, he's been increasingly absent, giving Bradley significant latitude. What about the Tech Vision acquisition? Has the board thoroughly reviewed their financials? Sandra sighed. Bradley has been controlling the flow of information. The materials presented to the board paint Tech Vision as a unicorn opportunity that will revolutionize our portfolio. Any concerns have been minimized or attributed to outdated analysis methods. There's something else going on, I said, sharing my recent discoveries about Parker Williams's history. I think Tech Vision may be significantly overvalued, possibly fraudulently so. Sandra looked troubled. The final vote is scheduled for next week's board meeting. If what you're saying is true, we could be walking into a disaster. There's more, I admitted and explained the loyalty clause in my contract. Sandra's eyes widened as I described the potential $88 million liability. Robert always did think several steps ahead, she murmured. He must have anticipated something like this might happen eventually. The question is, what do we do with this information, I asked. Sandra considered for a moment. The board meeting is scheduled for next Friday. All major stakeholders will be present, including Robert, who's flying back specifically for the Tech Vision vote. She met my gaze directly. I think it's time Bradley faces the consequences of his actions, don't you? Together we formulated a plan. Sandra would ensure I had access to the building for the board meeting. Rachel would prepare a legal presentation regarding my contract violation, and I would compile all my evidence about Tech Vision into an irrefutable case. As I left the coffee shop, I felt something I hadn't experienced since being fired hope. Bradley had underestimated me, treating me as an obstacle to be removed rather than a professional worthy of respect. That mistake was about to cost him dearly. Over the next week, I worked tirelessly coordinating with Rachel to prepare our strategy. We decided that we wouldn't immediately demand the full $88 million. That would be our leverage, but our primary goal was to protect Maxwell Enterprises from the Tech Vision fraud and to restore my professional reputation. The night before the board meeting, I barely slept, rehearsing what I would say, anticipating Bradley's counterarguments, and steeling myself for what would undoubtedly be an intense confrontation. By morning, I was exhausted but resolved. Today would determine not just my future, but potentially the future of Maxwell Enterprises itself. Friday morning dawned clear and bright, a beautiful October day that belied the storm I was about to unleash. I dressed carefully in my most professional outfit, a charcoal gray suit that had always given me confidence during important presentations. Rachel arrived at my condo at 8:30, looking every inch the high-powered attorney, in a tailored black suit, carrying a leather portfolio containing all our documentation. "Ready for this?" she asked as we rode the elevator down to the lobby. "As ready as I'll ever be," I replied, smoothing invisible wrinkles from my jacket. We took Rachel's car to the Maxwell Enterprises building, arriving 15 minutes before the scheduled start of the board meeting. My heart raced as we approached the familiar glass and steel structure where I had spent so many years of my career. At the security desk, Luis's eyes widened in recognition. "Miss Williams," he said, clearly surprised to see me. "Good morning, Luis. We're here for the board meeting." Luis looked uncomfortable. "I don't have you on the visitor list, Miss Williams." Before I could respond, Sandra appeared in the lobby, approaching with purposeful strides. "They're with me, Luis. I'm escorting them to the meeting personally." Luis hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, Miss Johnson." As we walked toward the elevator, Sandra spoke in a low voice. "Bradley instructed security not to admit you under any circumstances. Fortunately, as a board member, I can override that." The elevator ride to the 35th floor felt surreal. Just 10 days ago, I had made this same journey in the opposite direction, escorted by security guards carrying a box of my personal belongings. Now I was returning not as a disgraced former employee, but as someone prepared to challenge the company's leadership. The meeting started 5 minutes ago, Sandra informed us. They're discussing preliminary matters before the Tech Vision vote. Your timing will be perfect. Outside the boardroom, Sandra paused. Are you certain about this, Jasmine? Once we walk through those doors, there's no turning back. I took a deep breath. I'm certain. What Bradley did was wrong both to me and potentially to the company. Sandra nodded and pushed open the heavy wooden doors. The Maxwell Enterprises boardroom was impressive, a long mahogany table surrounded by leather chairs, floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a panoramic view of Chicago and state-of-the-art presentation equipment. Around the table sat 12 people, the 9 board members, Bradley, the company's general counsel, William Baker, and Parker Williams, CEO of Tech Vision. All conversation ceased as we entered. Bradley, who had been standing at the head of the table mid-presentation, froze mid-sentence. His face registered shock, then anger as he recognized me. What is the meaning of this interruption? He demanded, looking at Sandra. We're in the middle of a board meeting. I've invited Jasmine and her attorney to address the board on a matter of urgent importance, Sandra replied calmly. Her attorney Bradley's voice rose. This is completely inappropriate. Security. Before you call security, Rachel stepped forward. I suggest you consider the legal implications of refusing to hear evidence of contract violations and potential fraud. Robert Maxwell, who I hadn't seen in months, rose from his seat at the opposite end of the table. He looked older than I remembered, his face lined with fatigue or worry. Jasmine, what's going on here? Perhaps I can explain, Rachel said, opening her portfolio and extracting a document. My name is Rachel Bennett, and I represent Jasmine Williams in her wrongful termination claim against Maxwell Enterprises. Bradley scoffed. There was no wrongful termination. Her position was eliminated during restructuring. Restructuring. Robert looked confused. What restructuring? I was told Jasmine resigned. A murmur ran through the board members. William Baker, the general counsel, leaned forward with evident concern. May I ask what specific claim you're making, Miss Bennett? He asked. Rachel placed a copy of my contract on the table. My client's employment contract, signed 4 years ago when she was promoted to head of due diligence, contains specific protections against termination without cause. She directed everyone's attention to the relevant section. This clause explicitly states that Miss Williams' position cannot be terminated without documented performance issues, a formal improvement plan, and board approval. William picked up the contract, adjusting his glasses as he read the section. His expression grew increasingly troubled. Furthermore, Rachel continued, the contract stipulates that in the event of improper termination, Miss Williams is entitled to compensation equal to 5% of the company's current market valuation. A board member I recognized as Thomas Richards, a veteran investment banker, let out a low whistle. That would be approximately $88 million at current valuation. Rachel finished for him. The room fell silent. Bradley's face had drained of color. Parker Williams looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. This is absurd, Bradley finally sputtered. Dad, you can't possibly have authorized this clause. All eyes turned to Robert, who was still studying the contract. I did authorize it, he said quietly. Jasmine was instrumental in saving us from several potentially disastrous acquisitions. This clause was meant to protect her from exactly this kind of situation. Bradley looked stricken. You gave her a golden parachute, without telling me, your own son. I never anticipated it would be needed, Robert replied, his disappointment evident. I certainly never imagined you would fire her without consulting the board, especially not while I was away. William Baker cleared his throat. If this clause is as described, the company faces significant liability. He looked at Bradley. Was the board consulted before Miss Williams' termination? The uncomfortable silence that followed was answer enough. Sandra spoke up. As a board member, I can confirm we were told Miss Williams had resigned. We were never asked to approve her termination. This is just a misunderstanding, Bradley insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. A simple administrative oversight that can be rectified. There's more, I said, speaking for the first time since entering the room. All eyes turned to me. I was terminated immediately after raising serious concerns about the TechVision acquisition, concerns that were dismissed without proper investigation. Parker Williams shifted uncomfortably in his seat as I distributed copies of my analysis to everyone at the table. TechVision's financials show multiple red flags indicating potential fraud. I explained, walking them through the discrepancies I had identified, the mismatched revenue figures, the artificially low expenses, and the network of shell companies. Furthermore, I continued, this isn't the first time Parker Williams has been involved in such a situation. I detailed his history with 3 previous failed startups, each following the same pattern. As the board members reviewed my documentation, their expressions grew increasingly alarmed. Parker Williams stood abruptly. This is slander. I won't sit here and listen to these baseless accusations. If they're baseless, then you should have no objection to a more thorough investigation before the acquisition proceeds, I countered. Robert turned to Bradley, his expression a mixture of anger and disappointment. Did you investigate any of these concerns before dismissing Jasmine? Bradley's silence was damning. William Baker looked grim. Given these revelations, I strongly advise postponing the TechVision vote until we can conduct an independent audit. That's not necessary, Bradley insisted. Parker has explained all these discrepancies. They're just using unconventional accounting methods because they're a cutting-edge startup. Actually, Thomas Richards interjected as someone who's evaluated hundreds of startups. What Jasmine has identified goes well beyond unconventional. These are textbook red flags for financial manipulation. Parker Williams made a move toward the door, but Sandra smoothly stepped into his path. I believe we'd appreciate you staying until we resolve this matter, Mr. Williams. Robert stood his authority, filling the room despite his recent absence. I think we need to address several issues immediately. He turned to William. First, I want your legal assessment of Jasmine's contract and our potential liability. William adjusted his glasses nervously. Based on my preliminary review, the clause appears enforceable. If Miss Williams was indeed terminated without board approval and without following the prescribed process, we could be facing the full $88 million liability. A collective intake of breath filled the room. Bradley looked physically ill. Second, Robert continued, I want an emergency executive session of the board to discuss both the TechVision acquisition and Bradley's actions regarding Jasmine's termination. He turned to Parker Williams. Mr. Williams, I apologize, but I must ask you to leave while we conduct this session. Parker looked like he wanted to object but thought better of it. With a final glare in my direction, he exited the boardroom. Jasmine, Rachel, Robert addressed us. Would you mind waiting outside while we deliberate? I promise this won't take long. We nodded and left the boardroom, finding seats in the adjacent waiting area. Through the glass walls, we could see animated discussion with Robert doing most of the talking, while Bradley sat with his head in his hands. I think they're taking this seriously, Rachel observed. They should, I replied. $88 million tends to focus the mind. The waiting area outside the boardroom had become painfully familiar over the past 45 minutes. Rachel and I sat in tense silence occasionally, catching glimpses of the heated discussion continuing behind the glass walls. Board members' gesticulated papers were passed around, and Bradley alternated between defensive posturing and defeated slumping. The door finally opened, and Parker Williams emerged, his face flushed with anger. He stopped short when he saw me. You've made a serious mistake, he hissed. Nobody crosses me and comes out ahead. Rachel stood immediately. That sounds remarkably like a threat, Mr. Williams. Would you care to clarify for the record? Parker's jaw tightened, but he said nothing further, storming toward the elevator instead. Moments later, Bradley appeared in the doorway, his usual confidence noticeably absent. The board is taking a brief recess, he announced stiffly. They've asked to speak with you separately, Jasmine. I exchanged glances with Rachel, who nodded encouragingly. I'll be right here, she assured me. As Bradley and I walked toward a small conference room, an uncomfortable silence stretched between us. Finally, he spoke in a low voice. You've really done it now, he said. Are you happy? You might have just tanked a deal that could have transformed this company. A fraudulent deal that could have destroyed this company. I corrected him. That's what you're not seeing, Bradley. I never wanted to harm Maxwell Enterprises. I've always tried to protect it even from its own leadership when necessary. How noble, he sneered, but the effect was diminished by the visible anxiety in his expression. So what's your endgame here? The 88 million? That was never my primary goal, I said, honestly. I wanted the truth to come out both about my termination and about TechVision. We reached the conference room where Bradley gestured for me to enter. Well, congratulations. You've certainly accomplished that. With that parting shot, he left me alone in the room. A few minutes later, Robert entered looking tired but resolute. He sat across from me, studying my face before speaking. First, let me apologize, Jasmine. What happened to you was unacceptable and completely contrary to the values I've tried to instill in this company. Thank you, I said, genuinely appreciating his acknowledgement. The board is still deliberating, but I wanted to speak with you privately first. Robert folded his hands on the table. Your analysis of TechVision was spot on. We've already contacted forensic accountants to begin a thorough investigation, and based on their preliminary findings, we've suspended all acquisition talks. Relief washed over me. That's good to hear. As for your termination, Robert continued, there's no question it violated both company policy and your specific contract terms. The board recognizes our liability. He leaned forward. However, before we proceed with formal decisions, I wanted to ask, what outcome are you hoping for? Jasmine. I had given this question considerable thought over the past week. I don't want to damage the company, Robert. Despite everything that's happened, I still care about Maxwell Enterprises and the people who work there. I know you do, Robert said, with a sad smile. That's part of why this situation is so troubling. What I want is accountability, I continued. Bradley needs to face consequences for his actions both toward me and in pushing the TechVision deal despite clear warning signs. Robert nodded slowly. That's already being addressed. And the $88 million question? I took a deep breath. I don't need the full amount. What I want is recognition of the wrong that was done, appropriate compensation for the damage to my career, and structural changes to prevent something like this from happening again. Robert looked relieved but curious. What kind of structural changes? Better oversight of executive decisions, more transparent due diligence processes, and protection for employees who raise legitimate concerns about company actions. Those are reasonable requests, Robert acknowledged, and specific compensation. I'll leave that to the negotiations between Rachel and your legal team, I said. But I'm more interested in finding a path forward than in punishing the company. Robert stood and extended his hand. Thank you for your candor, Jasmine. I think we can find a resolution that serves justice without harming the company you've helped build. When we returned to the boardroom, all eyes turned to us. Rachel gave me a questioning look, and I nodded reassuringly. The board has reached several preliminary decisions, Robert announced, taking his place at the head of the table. First, the TechVision acquisition is officially on hold pending a full investigation. Based on Jasmine's analysis and our initial verification, we believe there are significant misrepresentations in their financial reporting. Bradley started to object, but Robert silenced him with a look. Second, regarding Jasmine's termination, the board acknowledges that proper procedures were not followed and that her contract terms were violated. William Baker, the general counsel, spoke up. We propose entering into settlement negotiations immediately to resolve this matter without protracted litigation. Rachel nodded. My client is open to good faith negotiations. Third, Robert continued, effective immediately. Bradley Maxwell is suspended from his duties as Vice President of Strategy pending a full review of his actions regarding both Jasmine's termination and the TechVision acquisition. Bradley's face reddened. Dad, you can't be serious. This is our company. This is my company, Robert corrected firmly. A company built on integrity and careful stewardship principles you seem to have forgotten. The board meeting concluded with a formal resolution to establish an independent committee to investigate both situations. As people began gathering their belongings, news alerts started pinging on multiple phones around the table. Someone had leaked information about the halted acquisition and Bradley's suspension. Maxwell Enterprises stock is already responding, Thomas Richards noted, checking his phone. Down 3% on the TechVision news, but it could have been much worse if we'd gone through with a fraudulent acquisition. As Rachel and I prepared to leave, Sandra approached us. This isn't over, she warned quietly. Bradley won't accept this humiliation without a fight. Let him try, Rachel replied confidently. We have the facts and the law on our side. Outside the building, reporters had already gathered, alerted by the sudden stock movement and rumors of executive turmoil. Rachel skillfully deflected their questions as we made our way to her car. What happens now? I asked once we were safely inside. Now, Rachel said with a satisfied smile, we negotiate from a position of strength. The following weeks were a whirlwind of legal meetings, negotiations, and media speculation. The story had captured the attention of the financial press, with headlines highlighting the dramatic boardroom confrontation and the near miss of a potentially disastrous acquisition. 3 weeks after the fateful board meeting, Maxwell Enterprises issued a press release announcing a mutual resolution of all disputes with me. The carefully worded statement acknowledged the invaluable contributions I had made to the company and expressed regret for the miscommunication surrounding her departure. What the press release didn't mention was the actual settlement. We had negotiated a $15 million payment, a newly created position, as Chief Risk Officer, reporting directly to the board, and a seat on the board of directors itself. The company had also agreed to implement new whistleblower protections and enhance due diligence protocols for all future acquisitions. As for TechVision, the forensic accounting investigation confirmed everything I had suspected and worse. Parker Williams was now facing SEC investigations and potential criminal charges for securities fraud. The bullet Maxwell Enterprises had dodged was even larger than I had initially realized. And Bradley, his suspension had turned into a reassignment. He now headed a small subsidiary with strict oversight and significantly reduced authority. Robert had been unwilling to remove his son entirely from the company, but had ensured he would have limited opportunity to cause further damage. The ordeal had been painful, but as I prepared for my first day in my new role, I couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication. I had stood my ground, fought for what was right, and emerged stronger for it. 2 months after the dramatic board meeting that changed everything, I found myself standing in front of the mirror in my condo adjusting the lapel of my new suit. Today marked my first official board meeting as both Chief Risk Officer and a member of the Board of Directors. The face looking back at me showed subtle changes. There was a new confidence in my eyes, a certain steadiness that comes only from being tested and emerging stronger. The settlement had been finalized 3 weeks ago after intense negotiations. While the $88 million figure had loomed large over the discussions, I had never intended to demand the full amount. My goal had been accountability and change, not vengeance. In the end, we settled on a package that satisfied both parties, a $15 million settlement, my new dual role in the company, and significant structural reforms to Maxwell Enterprises' governance. The money itself felt almost secondary to the vindication. After taxes, I had used a portion to pay off my student loans, and my mother's mortgage invested the majority for retirement, and donated a substantial amount to a nonprofit that helped first-generation college students navigate the financial world. Financial security was liberating, but what meant more was having my professional judgment validated. As I drove to the Maxwell Enterprises headquarters, I reflected on the whirlwind of changes that had occurred since that confrontation. the TechVision deal had ultimately been completely restructured. Once our forensic accountants exposed the financial manipulation, Parker Williams had been forced out by TechVision's board. Under new leadership and with a much more realistic valuation, we had acquired a 40% stake in the company, rather than purchasing it outright. The technology was indeed promising. It had simply been buried under layers of financial deception and hype. Walking into the building felt different now. Luis at security greeted me with a warm smile and a respectful, "Good morning, Director Williams." The elevator ride to the executive floor no longer filled me with anxiety, but with purpose. I had earned my place here not just once, but twice. The boardroom was already half full when I arrived. Sandra Johnson waved me over to the seat beside her. "Ready for your first meeting on this side of the table?" she asked. "As ready as I'll ever be," I replied, setting down my portfolio. Robert Maxwell arrived a few minutes later, nodding in my direction with what seemed like genuine approval. Our relationship had evolved into something new, not the former mentor divided by protege dynamic, but a more equal partnership based on mutual respect. Bradley was conspicuously absent from the board meeting, as he had been reassigned to head a small subsidiary focused on early-stage investments. The role kept him within the company, but with significant oversight and limited authority. I had heard through office gossip that he was actually doing reasonably well in the position, perhaps finally finding a role that suited his actual skills rather than his ambitions. "Before we begin," Robert said, once everyone was seated, "I'd like to formally welcome Jasmine Williams to her first board meeting. As you all know, Jasmine has taken on the newly created role of Chief Risk Officer while also joining our board. Her experience and insight will be invaluable as we navigate the challenges ahead." There was a round of applause and I felt a warmth in my chest that had been absent during those dark days after my termination. This was validation not just of my professional abilities but of my integrity. The meeting proceeded with updates on various aspects of the business. When it came time for my report, I presented the new risk assessment framework I had developed, designed to provide earlier warnings about potential issues in acquisitions and major business decisions. This framework would have flagged the TechVision issues immediately, I explained, but more importantly, it creates a system where concerns can be raised and addressed transparently without fear of repercussion. The board unanimously approved the new framework, and I caught Robert's eye across the table. He gave me a subtle nod that conveyed both approval and something like apology. We had never directly discussed his role in allowing Bradley to gain so much unchecked power, but this silent acknowledgement was enough. He had learned from his blind spot regarding his son, and I had learned valuable lessons of my own. After the meeting, Robert asked me to join him in his office. The view of Chicago from his windows was as spectacular as ever, but the man himself seemed changed. There was a humility to him that hadn't been there before. "You've done remarkable work with the risk framework, Jasmine," he said, gesturing for me to take a seat. "The board is impressed." "Thank you," I said simply. "It's work I believe in." "I owe you an apology," Robert said, surprising me with his directness. I should have been more present, more aware of what was happening with Bradley. My absence created the opportunity for him to act as he did. "You trusted your son," I replied. "That's natural. Trust should be earned, not assumed," Robert countered. "Even with family. Perhaps especially with family." He looked out at the city for a moment before continuing. "Bradley is doing better in his new role. More focused, less concerned with power. Perhaps this was what he needed all along, a position that suits his actual talents." "I'm glad to hear that," I said sincerely. I had never wished for Bradley's destruction, only for accountability. "The company culture is changing too," Robert observed. "People are more willing to speak up when they see problems. Your story has become something of an inspiration." It was true. In the weeks since my return, I had noticed a shift in how people interacted. There was more open discussion, less fear of raising concerns. The whistleblower protections we had implemented were part of it, but so was the visible example of someone who had stood up for what was right and ultimately been vindicated. That means more to me than the settlement, I admitted. Robert nodded, understanding. Money is just money. Legacy is about the values you instill. He extended his hand. Thank you for helping preserve what matters most about this company. As I left Robert's office, I ran into Hannah from Human Resources, who had been present during my termination. She had avoided eye contact with me since my return. Jasmine? She said, looking genuinely remorseful. I've been meaning to speak with you. I wanted to apologize for my role in what happened. I should have questioned the process more. Thank you, Hannah, I said, recognizing the courage it took for her to approach me. We all face moments where we have to decide whether to speak up or stay silent. I've learned from your example, she said. We all have. On my way home that evening, I called my mother to share how the day had gone. Teresa had been my rock throughout the ordeal, never doubting that I would emerge stronger. I'm so proud of you, baby, she said, not just for the fancy new title, but for standing up for yourself when it would have been easier to walk away. I learned that. From you, I reminded her. You never let hardship define you. That's right, she agreed. And now look at you turning a painful experience into something positive for yourself and others. She was right. The journey had been difficult, full of moments of doubt, humiliation, and anger. There had been days when I questioned whether the fight was worth it, when settling quietly seemed the easier path. But standing firm had led to an outcome I could never have anticipated, not just personal vindication, but systemic change. The healing hadn't happened overnight. For weeks after my termination, I had struggled with anger and a sense of betrayal. The humiliation of being escorted from the building had left emotional scars that took time to fade. But gradually, as I channeled those feelings into productive action, I found myself moving past the bitterness towards something more constructive. My new role allowed me to implement changes that would benefit not just myself, but everyone at Maxwell Enterprises. The risk assessment framework, the whistleblower protections, the more transparent governance, these were my true legacy, far more significant than the settlement amount. As I arrived home and kicked off my heels, I thought about how sometimes our greatest setbacks can become our most powerful opportunities. Bradley had fired me thinking he was eliminating an obstacle, never imagining he was actually setting in motion events that would transform both our lives and the company itself. There's a freedom that comes from being underestimated. When people don't see your full value, they don't anticipate your full strength. Bradley had seen me as just clutter, a dismissible inconvenience, not recognizing that I had built myself from far more substantial material than he realized. The contract clause had been the leverage, but my true power had come from something more fundamental, the courage to stand up for what was right, even when standing alone. That was the lesson I hoped others would take from my story. Your value isn't determined by how others treat you, but by how firmly you hold to your principles when those principles are tested. Sometimes life pushes you down only to position you to stand up taller than before. What looks like an ending might actually be the beginning of something far better than you could have imagined. The key is to never let someone else's perception of your worth define your own sense of value. Have you ever been underestimated and found it to be your greatest advantage? Share your story in the comments below. And if this tale of standing up to corporate injustice resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of resilience and triumph. Remember that sometimes your greatest power comes when others least expect it. Thank you for listening, and may you always know your true worth, no matter what challenges come your way.